I guess I want to throw really to anyone who wants to jump in here, but my gut feeling is to start it off with a kind of question about where distribution is now, and I thought the best way to perhaps get into that topic is to really say, well, where was it 5 years ago? What are the most significant changes that these guys have really picked up in the sector over the last 5 years? And then after that, we'll probably go into where they think the next 5 years are. But I actually might just throw to John, as someone who's been both a producer and distributor first, and just sort of to get a sense of how you see the landscape and how it was perhaps 5 years ago.
Maybe 5 years ago, it would be defined by people aggressively defending their windows with cinema, DVD, pay television, and free television. That's sort of the summary up until what I believe has been the change. The change has probably started before then. And what's actually happened in that period is that by the defence of these windows, of course, it's a bit like leaving alcohol sales only to hotels. There's been created another industry which people call piracy or whatever else. And we're seeing now, while people are still vigorously defending these windows, basically, it's moved on. Most people are actually looking at images that, they download on DVD. For instance, there's an article today in, the Australian Review, where a reviewer in there, Miss Lyndon Barber, I think, talks about how poor the Australian industry is in terms of its, market share last year, etc., and how wonderful France is. What it didn't mention that in France last year, and this is well documented, there are 120 illegal downloads of feature films, which was the first time exceeded admissions to all French cinemas. So it's moved on, It's like the music industry, the feature film industry and the film industry haven't quite sort of woken up that it's happened, and they're now trying to struggle to find a way around it.
And if I can perhaps throw to Natalie, in terms of cinemas, actual cinema attendances and cinema release patterns, what do you think are it seemed a number of years ago that there were perhaps 70 or 80, particularly in terms of independent features, perhaps 70 or 80 features in the independent arena released a year, and now that number seems to have increased enormously. How as a cinema operator and distributor are you seeing
Well,
that?
I think, sort of following on the question before as well about in the last 5 years, the most enormous difference is the number of films. And if you're a distributor and if you're an exhibitor, and if I may throw in, and Tate said to me in an email yesterday, you're going to be the exhibitor or the distributor today, they're so closely intertwined, because if you're a good exhibitor, you're sort of half distributing their film anyway, so you talk about the two things together. And there is so much product that it's very hard for an exhibitor to sort of sort through to screen. It's very hard, I think, for filmmakers to make their film, to bang on the door and make their film get noticed. And I think, if I go back to early years of my career, I had a Longford Cinema in South Yarra. We ran films like Mona Lisa and Truly Madly Deeply, and My Left Foot exclusive at the Longford. Now, if you look at the change in the industry today, it's just enormous. And I think one of the biggest problems facing filmmakers is getting their product noticed and films fighting for a place. And in addition, all the DVD distributors, there's quite a lot of them, are now putting out their films. A lot of them, with respect to Madman, I won't say they're doing this, but a lot of them try and get smaller films out to profile them for their DVD release. So they think the theatrical is going to be, great advertising, a marketing thing. So, what I say is that a lot of films shouldn't even be released theatrically. I'll leave that one for a later discussion.
Just so people get a sense of the scale, last year there was actually 300, new releases in the marketplace, whereas, 5 years ago, yes, it might have been a third of that. And
certainly in the independents particularly has really increased.
Oh, it's extraordinary. But the other major difference is just the sheer size of gross box office. this year it was an increase on 4% over last year, so it's actually broken records yet again, and sitting at about $946 million. So the actual size of the market and theatrical marketplace is a lot bigger than it was 5 years ago. But at the same time, the share of Australian films, with a couple of very notable exceptions, is lower than it's been for years. Like 5 years ago, we were bringing out Japanese Story. We, sit in the marketplace at that time, had a box office take of around 4.5 million. Strange Bedfellows in the same year had 5 million. Last year, there were only 2 Australian films, other than Australia, that exceeded 1 million in gross box office. So that's, there's something really odd that's happening at that end of the scale as well.
Yeah, I mean, and the question is also the access to screens. I mean, if you're going to get the stats on, one of the big statistics has been the actual shift in how hard it is actually to get onto screens for numbers, how many are being taken up by blockbusters. So not only are you releasing more independent films, but you're releasing them into a reducing number of screens.
Well, 5 years ago we might have been able to what is known as a platform, and classic examples of that would be a film that Tate, in fact 2 films Tate oversaw, which was Lantana, which is a classic platforming, and then Japanese Story. And I know Natalie's done this many times, where you allow the word of mouth to build over a number of weeks, and gradually, a film can hold its place and really build an increasing audience. Whereas, of course, now we're in the world in this, absolute glut of product that you have to perform in that first weekend, second weekend, and if you're not, by God, you're out of there, because, there's another 10 films behind you that can take that screen for the exhibitor and earn a lot more money.
Nick, as a new player, relatively new player, I mean, you've come from been hugely successful in the areas you were, and you're now increasingly moving into features, both documentary and drama. I mean, how do you see? You're obviously seeing this as an opportunity. You've obviously said this is a realm we can move into, away from our kind of traditional what we've done before. How do you see the landscape you're moving into?
Well, I mean, there are very many more ways for people to consume their content. And look, the theatrical numbers have grown, and on top of the 300 films a year theatrically, there are another 300 a month going out on home video and so forth. So there's the numbers on home video last year were up both in dollar terms and in units sold. So there are more and more ways to connect with the audience, which is a good thing. It's getting harder and harder to make margin on all those little connection points. But theatrically, it's the market has shrunk, and certainly along the eastern seaboard, Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne have all lost great independent cinemas that were places where you could run. The Leopard on re-release ran for 16 weeks or longer at the Lumiere.
Oh, but that's the Leopard.
Yeah, but it did run for a long time. But you just simply can't do that anymore. And so we lost the Lumiere in Melbourne, we lost the Valhalla, we lost the Chanel, and it's and those were places where you could, with a lot of independence, give them that time to breathe, to find an audience, and that audience then to sort of take the ball under its arm and run with it for you. And so it is certainly tougher theatrically, but converse to that is, of course, there are so many other ways to talk to your audience.
But the biggest issue you have is just the margins. I mean, if you're getting them out through these other things, in terms of actually making returns, it's the margins, which is
well, certainly things like price point on DVD has dropped because of the volume of content. You're not getting the TV, the money for TV you used to get. Airlines, they're taking more films, but you get less for the films as a result. So you're getting more out there, but you're getting less for it at each point. And yes, costs have gone down, cost of doing business has gone down across the board, but that has certainly plateaued now. So the returns that we were getting on home video, for example, 5 years ago, compared to today, and when I say we, I mean us and the producers, licensors of the films, are just not there per title.
And just as a quick, immediately, just in terms of where we've come, and we can get on in a moment to saying where we sort of see the next 5 years perhaps, but what immediate implications are there for filmmakers entering this market in terms of,
Well, I'll give you a very good idea about this. For instance, it really depends on whether or not you're going out around the time of a tentpole. I mean, when Australia went out, it went out on 650 screens. There are 2,000 screens in Australia, and so you've got roughly round about a third of the screens occupied by one film. I remember a couple of years ago, I can't remember what was out, but I had a quick look at what was around over the holidays and over the Christmas holidays, and I think 3 films occupied something like 1,250 screens. And then the rest of the screens were actually by a whole combination of all sorts of other films. And without a doubt, it's the major cinema chains, which are really owned by just really a couple of companies, really rely almost entirely upon their tentpoles. And in between that, they just have product that fills up. That, of course, exposes them to one of the great sort of potential market failures. Just looking them in, completely looking at them, of course, is that when 2 or 3 of these fail in a row, there'll be collapses all over the world in cinema chains.
But if you've made a great film, if you make a great Australian film, not even a great one, a good one, I still think you will get it onto screens. I think one of the problems is it's difficult to get films that are mediocre onto these exhibitor screens because you're competing with the product from all around the world, and films from Europe, not just the American films. And I still, John, has there been any Australian film that's never made it to the theatrical release?
I don't think that's really the issue, Natalie, because really, it's very easy to get a lot of mediocre American films on screens on a very consistent basis because of the power and the volume that the major distributors have and the relationships with the major exhibitors. So in some sort of way, this is also going to affect on audience growth. The figures that were quoted, there was a 4% increase in box office last year, but there was not a 4% increase in admissions. I think you find the 4% is, it's the cost of the cinema ticket has gone up. When I take my son to the cinema, he complains about it. He says, "What a rip-off." And he doesn't even pay for it. Because everything he sees is for free. He puts on his computer, he puts on the television, he switches on the radio, he opens up, his phone. Everything is there as free.
But even if you're buying it, you can buy a DVD for $10. That's what it shocks me compared to even music. You can actually buy a DVD.
Or you can download them overnight for nothing.
Or you can download them for nothing if you can.
Millions and millions of downloads are happening, all over the world, all over the time. Again, because, like for instance, I've got 4 pictures coming up this year, and I'm working very hard to create a demand for them. But the demand that I create will be, for instance, in one of the films, only available in cinemas, maybe 12 or 15 cinemas. So the demand for those people who, A, can't afford to go to the cinema, want to see it on a DVD, happy to wait for it some other way, can't get to a cinema, etc. What I am creating is, in fact, not only a demand for it on a downstream, but an immediate demand for it that people will find it some other way. And, of course, it'll be pirated.
Which comes back to something you touched on earlier, though, in terms of the windows, and I think one of the things moving forward that filmmakers are going to need to be aware of, and distributors, is playing with the windows to suit the film. Some films warrant a theatrical release then to TV before DVD, or maybe even TV straight to DVD because it's the best way to, 1, to get the audience, and 2, to maximise the film's returns. Well,
this is a question about the future of distribution. There has been attempts to do day and date releasing, which this whole issue that John raised about the windows. In the traditional distribution patterns, you'd release on film, you'd wait a while, then you'd release on video, and then you'd wait a while, and then you'd release on pay TV, and then you'd wait a while. Over the last 5 years, those windows have absolutely collapsed.
If I can just add something, I've got this apocryphal story that fits into that, where some friends of mine that live in Manhattan told me the story, where the leader in this field in the US is a company called IFC, Independent Film Channel, which ironically is backed by a pay TV channel called the Independent Film Channel. They set up the leading VOD service in the States, and they did something really interesting as part of their strategy. They went so far as to buy a Manhattan cinema. Now, can you imagine what it costs, not to buy, but to lease a Manhattan cinema, called the IFC Centre? And they did this a few years ago, and it seemed that they were entering into the art house specialised exhibition scene. But in fact, they weren't at all. What they were doing was renting a very expensive publicity platform. And so they released the film. So last year at Cannes, when everyone said the market was shot, the biggest buyer for the North American market was IFC. And they don't pay a great deal for your film, and they offer you, it's meant to be like they're offering you some sort of bonus. I don't quite see it, by the way. But they offer you, we'll do a theatrical release, or we may not, but we'll go out on our VOD service. And so what they do is, for most of the films, they release them in Manhattan at the IFC Centre, which is actually a pretty good cinema, with a couple of screens. And that gives you New York Times and other New York media coverage of the film. But they don't necessarily release all those films in the other cities of the US. They use the New York media platform to promote the film. The other thing they do, though, day and date, they put it on VOD. And what I thought was the frightening bit of the story is my friends were telling me this story and said, and we realised that we knew if it was on at the IFC Centre, 4 blocks from our house, then it was available online. And we just get it online rather than walk 4 blocks to the cinema. These people work in the film business. And I just thought, oh my God, that is the future. And I was asking Nick about, I thought of all people in Australia, Madman would be the first to actually try and embrace this. But maybe you want to answer, Nick, but the short answer is, of course, our broadband speeds aren't up to it, and then there's more complex answers. But that's the future. And some of those films go on to the major sort of 8 or 10 US cities, but a lot of them only have this New York release. And I just love the idea that they've gone so far as to have their own cinema, which is basically a publicity platform.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's basically the most expensive bit of red carpet you can buy. And I'm interested because there could be a whole panel about the future of exhibition, because the distribution stuff connects into exhibition, but there's now a whole series of new ways to get your films to markets. And maybe, Natalie, you can say about what cinemas are doing to try and create events, because one of the debates a number of years ago was about the fact that a lot of our chains were looking shabby. People didn't want to go. Not only was it expensive to go to the cinemas, but then you had to deal with your children buying all sorts of stuff at the concession bars, and the whole event was, particularly in Sydney, there's no parking, it's really expensive, you've got to get babysitters, so it's actually a $150 event by the time you get home, whereas you can just download it for free or download it cheaply. So I'm just wondering what the cinemas are doing about that to actually continue to make it actually an event, an activity.
I think the cinema's very conscious of all this, and I, for one, am totally, utterly confident in the future of theatrical exhibition, because I think if we go, it's an old Adam Elliott always says, he quotes my story, but I say when you go back to the old days, people sat round in a cave hearing stories. Our cinemas are a bit like the cave, and people like to get together. So you start with that as a premise, but yes, I think all cinemas are doing more about putting in comfortable seats, making the experience much better. We ourselves, even at the Nova, have just got a license. We held out for our 11 screens to get a liquor licence where you can take the drinks into the cinema. All sorts of things to refine going to the cinema as an event, and then creating events around everything that happens. We've got Love is the Beast, we've got Eric Bana coming to the cinema. We have to forever be sort of reinventing ideas and keeping your profile. We haven't touched today, and I'm sure, Richard, you will, about marketing and bringing the film to the people, but that's one of the major things. We have to, as cinemas, make it exciting that people will come to our cinemas, and I think that is here to stay, but it's only adjunct to all the other things.
But one of the things, Natalie, that hasn't changed in 5 years, and that is the relationship between the exhibitors and the distributors in so far as the terms of trade. Like, that's been pretty static throughout, and on average, the exhibitors will take out a cut of around 70% of. It varies week to week, but on average, it's around 70% of the ticket price. And then, of course, we all know the exhibitors earn probably more on the candy bar anyway than what they're getting off the ticket price. But is that something that's likely to change? Because that is...
I don't think so, because I think the major distributors will fight that, because they don't look at it as terms for one cinema. They look at if they've got a chain of 50 cinemas.
Exhibitors won't change.
They won't. They're very.
And this is what we're up against as producers. This is a really major thing.
It's a part of it, but I think getting your films on the screen is a bigger part.
But even if you get your films on the screen, see, people might think, a small independent film that did brilliantly, some years ago was The Castle. It made about $10 million gross box office. And you think, well, those filmmakers would have, made a fair bit out of that because it was a really low-budget film. It's made for less than $1 million. But, of course, if you're taking, 70% straight off, so that's $7 million back to the exhibitor, and then out of the remaining $3 million, you're taking the marketing P&A, which is about $1 million, off that, and then out of the remaining $2 million, you're halving that with the distributor, and then out of the remaining $1 million, then covering the costs of making the film.
Just to answer, could I just say they were finishing the answer to Richard's question to me about what cinemas are doing. They are reinvesting a lot of money, which is sort of part of this money they're taking from you, and they are also. I think what we need to be talking about is the whole digital revolution, because the future is we won't be on 35 mil probably in 5 years' time. I mean, it's not about if we're doing it, it's when we're doing it. We already have a lot of digital-only screens, which is going to change the business dramatically. I think it's a good thing for Australian film, and we can come back to that 3D that a lot of them are putting in to bring people to the cinema. So I think cinemas are fighting back.
But, Sue, are you able to say anything public about Japanese Story? Or?
Well, only that, worldwide, Japanese Story grossed about $6 million, and it turned a nice little profit, which I'm very pleased it did for the distributor, and the exhibitors. I don't begrudge them in the slightest. But the sales agent made a clear profit as well. Everybody recouped their expenses, and at the end of the day, the filmmakers, from the total of that $6 million gross, we each got $13,000. So, this is why I'm coming back to the terms of the trade question, because if we're now starting to, and I do believe that the wild card in all of this now is the producer, because we're being incentivised now to start taking notice of the terms of trade, i.e. through the producer offset, we now have a level of equity. So in feature films, that's up to 40%. In documentaries, it's up to 20% of qualifying Australian production expenditure. Plus, there's a new initiative that Screen Australia has just announced about the sitting behind filmmakers in the revenue that comes in, not expecting everything to come in to go straight back to the agency. So we now have got filmmakers starting to think, well, maybe there is a way of building our businesses and being rewarded for the success of our films, which in the past we've never had any particular interest in that. We've not been entrepreneurial. I believe we've been lazy, and we've let audiences down as a result. Having an incentive to be involved, we can engage with distributors at a very early stage and be really interested in the kind of stories, not just good stories, but great stories that connect with audiences. And I'm actually very optimistic for where all this is going.
And from a South Australian perspective, of course, we have our new South Australian Producer Equity Scheme for South Australian producers, which is designed to do exactly the same thing.
Not that's my area at Screen Australia, but I have to say, of course, that's the whole producer offset is designed to empower producers and get them back, as Sue says, into the revenue streams. And again, I'm thinking, I learn a lot about the film business from studying what's happened in the music industry. Every week there's just some parallel. And as I think you said earlier, John was saying, we're so far behind the music industry. But this reminds me of all the complaints that musicians had about their, binding contracts with major record companies and how they were always screwed by major record companies. The digital revolution meant that they woke up one day and said, I don't need to be signed to Warners anymore. And they now control, or largely control and market their work, which is, I'm starting to see in the new gig at Screen Australia. Due to a bit of market failure from distribution, we're starting to see a lot of people, John being one of them, although John's been a distributor in the past.
30 years?
Yeah, 30 years. But not as your prime, 52 weeks a year for 30 years kind of.
It might not be prime, but it's been my prime income for 30 years.
Rather than production, yeah.
Absolutely.
And I'm taking a leaf out of his book.
Back to the producer.
Exactly, absolutely, following John's model.
We are seeing people unable to get conventional distribution deals approaching us, and it's not self-distribution in the manner that it would often be or previously imagined. What they're doing is, I think, the right way to do it. They're putting a team together. They're putting a team of experienced people together, because you can't just go and book your film into cinemas. Yeah. You need someone that's a very specific area of the business, and you need someone with that expertise. And then they're getting a publicity and marketing company, not to work on the film for 6 weeks, but to work on the film for 6 months and develop an entire long-term strategy. In fact, Sue just did a miniature version of this with her Dominic Dunn documentary. And interestingly, I've seen we've got 3 or 4 proposals just at the moment from producers working with different combinations of people. And as long as they can, I can't obviously say who they are, but as long as they can put a good package together that has real integrity and a professional approach, Screen Australia has a mechanism to support that P&A. Because those distributors, unlike the majors, they simply need the cash flow. They need our support because it's pretty expensive even to do a modest release. And at the same time, there's a couple of new distributors have just emerged very recently. So it's an interesting period that, again, I go back to the music industry analogy. I see it as they're like the equivalent of little indie labels.
And Tate, does that model work with the majors? Because I know Natalie has been a fantastic champion of filmmakers, independent distributors working in this way, and as indeed have a number of the independent exhibitors. But let's face it, the independent exhibitors are about 10% of the total number of exhibit screens out there. So
no, well that's what I meant about having someone who could book the cinemas. That you have to have someone who has the dialogue and can speak the language and to a certain degree has a relationship with the major exhibitors. When we talk about the majors, it's very simple. We mean Hoyts, Greater Union and Village. In South Australia it's Wallace, isn't it? Which is ultimately owned by...
And in Queensland, BCC, which are part of the Village Greater Union. Which
is Greater Union. So, and Readings, I should say Readings. So you've actually got 4 major chains that you need to deal with. And they are. There's a film that just opened in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane Thursday called The Combination, which is on about 35 screens. Mainstream screens. It's not an art movie by any means. And it's distributed by one of these new emerging companies called the Australian Film Syndicate.
One of the problems, I could just say one of the problems with the majors, even if you got on their screens, when I said exhibition and distribution are very closely linked, if we and some of the other more independent people take a smaller film or an independent film, it's called independent Australian film, we put a lot of effort and work behind it. You give it to the majors and they'll put it on your screen, but they're not going to put the grassroots. John's a master of the grassroots, he knows. And that's one of the issues, I think, of even if you win the battle and you get on their screens and you get good terms, they're not going to put that effort behind it. And I think that's a real issue.